What if I told you that some of the most powerful moments in World War II never made it into your history textbook? Not because they weren't important, but because someone, somewhere, made absolutely sure you would never hear about them. And today, I'm gonna take you through the most secret, most daring, most mind-blowing classified missions of the entire war. Missions so extreme that governments kept them buried for decades. Missions where a single mistake meant instant death, where the fate of nations hung on the decisions of just a handful of men and women operating completely in the shadows. So buckle up, because once you hear what these people actually did, you will never look at World War II the same way again. Let's start with something that sounds like it was pulled straight out of a horror movie, because in 1943, the British government took the body of a dead homeless man, a man nobody would ever miss, and turned him into a fake British officer named Major William Martin. They dressed him in a military uniform, handcuffed a briefcase full of completely fabricated top-secret documents to his wrist, loaded his corpse into a submarine, sailed it to the coast of Spain, and pushed him into the ocean. This was Operation Mincemeat, and the reason they did this was because the Allies were desperately trying to hide the fact that they were about to invade Sicily, one of the most important military secrets of the entire war. The British intelligence network, working through a secret committee literally called the Double Cross Committee, knew that if Germany figured out where the invasion was coming, the whole operation would be a slaughter. So they created an entire fake identity for this dead man, gave him letters between two British generals discussing a fake invasion of Greece, tucked in personal love letters to make it look authentic, even added a receipt for theater tickets, and then they let the body wash ashore where Spanish fishermen found it exactly as planned. The Germans got their hands on those documents, they believed every single word, they moved their troops to Greece expecting the attack, and when the Allies actually hit Sicily, the beaches were wide open. Thousands of Allied soldiers survived because of a dead man floating in the Atlantic with a briefcase full of lies. Now let's talk about something even more insane. A mission where America literally assassinated one of Japan's most powerful military leaders in broad daylight from the air. And they did it by cracking the enemy's secret codes. In April 1943, American codebreakers intercepted and deciphered a Japanese naval message that contained the exact travel itinerary of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the mastermind behind the attack on Pearl Harbor, the single most important military commander in the entire Japanese Navy. Suddenly, the Americans knew exactly where he was going to be, what time his plane would take off, and what route it would fly. The message went straight up the chain of command to President Roosevelt himself, and the order came back loud and clear: get Yamamoto. They assembled 18 P-38 Lightning fighter planes, a twin-engine beast that was the only aircraft in the American arsenal with enough range to pull this off, because the round-trip flight would cover over 1,000 miles across open ocean, and the fighters would only have about 10 minutes of combat time before they had to turn back or crash into the sea. The odds of even spotting Yamamoto's aircraft were calculated at 1 in 1,000, and yet on April 18, 1943, those P-38s found his bomber exactly on schedule, shot it down over the jungle of Bougainville Island, and killed the architect of Pearl Harbor. When the Japanese found Yamamoto's body the next morning, he was still strapped in his seat, his white-gloved hand still gripping his samurai sword. He had been killed instantly by bullets before the plane even hit the ground. Japan didn't tell its own public that Yamamoto was dead until over a month later, because the truth was simply too devastating.
And here is what makes this even more extraordinary. The Americans had to cover up the fact that they had broken Japan's codes, because if the Japanese ever realized their communications were being read, they would change everything and the Allies would lose one of their greatest intelligence advantages. So they invented a fake cover story and buried the real details for years. Now, I want to tell you about a mission so completely nuts that when Hitler himself heard about it, he was so furious and so bewildered that he demanded to know how it was even possible. In December 1942, 10 Royal Marine commandos were dropped off the coast of France by submarine, and their mission was to paddle canoes, actual canoes, 60 miles upstream through one of the most heavily defended river systems in all of occupied Europe to reach the port of Bordeaux and destroy German ships. This was Operation Frankton, and the reason they used canoes was because there was no other way in. Bordeaux was a critical supply hub for Nazi Germany, with ships carrying raw materials from Asia flowing through the port to fuel the war machine, and it was guarded by 32 warships, coastal defense guns, and anti-aircraft batteries, so a conventional attack by air, sea, or land would have been suicide. But 10 men in small folding kayaks? Nobody was watching for that. The problem was the journey. These canoes had to fight brutal tidal forces, freezing crosswinds, and ice-cold water, hiding along the riverbank during the day under camouflage, paddling only at night for 5 consecutive nights. One canoe capsized on the first night, and both men froze to death. 2 other teams were captured by the Germans and later executed without trial under Hitler's commando order. But 2 kayaks made it all the way to Bordeaux, and on the night of December 11th, the surviving commandos crept through the harbor, attached limpet mines to 6 German ships, set the timers, and vanished back into the darkness. By morning, explosions ripped through the port, and Hitler was left speechless with rage. How had this happened in one of his most fortified ports, and nobody saw a single thing? Out of the 10 men who paddled into France, only 2 ever made it home alive. The rest died in the freezing water, were executed, or vanished without a trace. But the mission sent a message through the entire war. Nowhere was safe. Now, let's move to something that goes even deeper into the shadows, because there was a mission that may have determined whether or not Nazi Germany ever built an atomic bomb, and it was carried out by a tiny group of Norwegian commandos who climbed down a 600-foot ice-covered ravine in the dead of winter to destroy one of the most critical facilities in the entire world. This was Operation Gunnerside, and the target was the Vemork hydroelectric plant in Norway. The reason this plant mattered is because it was the only place on Earth at that time capable of mass-producing heavy water, a substance absolutely essential to the German nuclear weapons program. If Germany acquired enough heavy water, physicist Werner Heisenberg could potentially build a nuclear reactor, and from there, an atomic bomb. The thought of Hitler with a nuclear weapon terrified every government in London and Washington. Britain had already tried twice to destroy the plant and failed completely. The first attempt involved a glider assault that ended in total disaster when both gliders crashed in the mountains, and every single man on board was either killed or captured and executed. So the SOE came up with a radically different plan. They would train Norwegian commandos in Scotland, parachute them into the wilderness 30 miles from the plant, and let them navigate their way in entirely on their own. The commandos landed in a brutal Norwegian winter, spent weeks surviving in the mountains, and then on the night of February 27, 1943, they made their move. Rather than attacking the guarded bridge leading to the plant, they descended 600 feet down an icy ravine, forded a freezing river, scaled the cliff on the other side, and entered through a cable tunnel. The Germans believed that descent was physically impossible, so there were no guards watching that route. The commandos slipped inside, placed explosive charges on the heavy water production cells, set the fuses, and vanished back into the ravine before the bombs even went off. Not a single shot was fired. Not one commando was killed or captured. SOE called it the most successful act of sabotage in all of World War II, and the mission set back the German nuclear program so severely that Germany never came close to building a bomb. Before the mission, each commando had been given a cyanide pill in case of capture. They knew going in that this could be a one-way trip, and they did it anyway. Now, let me tell you about a woman who walked into a Gestapo prison while her own face was on wanted posters across occupied France and walked out with 3 men who had been condemned to death. Her name was Christine Granville, and she was arguably the most dangerous spy Britain had during the entire war. Born in Poland, she was recruited by the SOE and spent 6 years behind enemy lines. The average life expectancy for a British agent in France was 6 weeks. Christine survived for 6 years. In July 1944, the regional SOE commander, Francis Kameratz, was arrested by the Gestapo along with 2 other agents, and all 3 were sentenced to be executed within hours. Christine had no army, no backup, no time. So she walked straight into the Gestapo headquarters, looked the commanding officer in the eye, and told him she was a British agent and the niece of Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. She told him Allied forces were closing in, the region was about to be liberated, and if he executed those prisoners, he would face brutal reprisals when the British arrived. She backed it up with a bribe of 2 million francs, which the SOE delivered within 24 hours. The Gestapo commander, now terrified of being captured by vengeful British forces, released all 3 prisoners, and his men even drove them out of town in a Gestapo vehicle. 3 men who were hours from execution walked free because one woman had the nerve and the audacity to walk into the lion's den and bluff her way through it. Earlier in the war, when Christine was arrested and interrogated by the Gestapo in Budapest, she bit her own tongue hard enough to draw blood and faked tuberculosis so convincingly that the Germans released her immediately, terrified of the contagious disease. She once passed through a German checkpoint while carrying a silk intelligence map. When she realized she couldn't hide it, she casually pulled it out and used it as a headscarf, greeting the soldiers in French as if she was just a local woman running an errand. Christine Granville is one of the most forgotten heroes of the entire war. And finally, let's talk about the most secret operation of all, the Manhattan Project. The level of secrecy surrounding this program was so extreme that it reshapes everything you think you know about how governments hide things. The Manhattan Project employed over 100,000 people across multiple secret cities: Oak Ridge in Tennessee, Hanford in Washington, Los Alamos in New Mexico, and almost none of them knew what they were actually building. Workers were divided into isolated teams, each allowed to see only their tiny piece of the puzzle. Every single piece of mail written by every worker was opened, read, and inspected by military intelligence before it was sent. If anything seemed remotely suspicious, agents would show up at your door. Physicist Richard Feynman used to send his wife coded puzzles in his letters just to antagonize the security guards, and they actually threatened to charge him with espionage. Feynman also repeatedly picked the locks on the safes holding classified documents just to prove how weak the security really was. General Leslie Groves, who ran the entire operation, created surveillance and counterintelligence programs that operated completely outside normal military channels. Congressional leaders agreed to secret budget processes with zero legislative oversight. Billions of dollars disappeared into the program, with virtually nobody in the government knowing where the money went or what it was being used for. And here is the darkest twist. Despite all of this extraordinary security, Soviet spies penetrated the Manhattan Project at the highest levels. Klaus Fuchs, a physicist working at Los Alamos, secretly transmitted detailed bomb designs, technical calculations, and production methods to Soviet intelligence agents the entire time he was there. By the time anyone discovered the betrayal, the damage was irreversible. The Soviet Union used that stolen information to build its own atomic bomb years ahead of schedule, and the nuclear arms race that defines the Cold War was born directly out of that theft.
The Manhattan Project remains one of the greatest demonstrations in history of what a government can accomplish when secrecy becomes the absolute top priority, and simultaneously one of the greatest intelligence failures because the most dangerous enemy was not on the outside, but working right alongside the people trying to protect the secret. These missions, a dead man with a briefcase of lies, fighter pilots hunting an admiral across 1,000 miles of ocean, 10 men in canoes against 32 warships, Norwegian commandos stopping Hitler's atomic bomb, a single woman talking her way out of a Gestapo death sentence, and 100,000 people building the most powerful weapon in history while Soviet spies watched from the inside. These are the moments that actually shaped the outcome of World War II. Not the massive ground battles, not the famous generals, the shadows, the deception, the handful of men and women who were willing to walk into the darkness and do what nobody else on earth would do. And the reason you never learned about most of this in school is because that was exactly the point.